So I've been thinking a lot about empathy lately, and the power of empathy. I think it has a lot to do with the power of imagination. There's some connection there. The ability to imagine what it feels like to walk in somebody else's shoes. True empathy, respectful empathy goes beyond that. It includes the ability to imagine what it feels like to walk in someone else's shoes and to know full well that only that person walks in his or her shoes. Oh, yeah. There are lots of seats up here. You should be comfortable. Lots of seats. So we recognize that while we can empathize with someone else's circumstance, we know that only that person lives in his or her skin. Only then they truly know what it feels like to be in their circumstance. And so we must not make assumptions or presumptions. And we shouldn't even try to solve that person's problem for him or her. The actions that we must take to support, to listen, to walk with the other, and to work with the other in pursuit of a change for the better. I can pull just one example from this week. I believe that the peace deal that has been brought forward is doomed from the start, because in good business, and this is not a comment on the content of the deal, this is about how it was constructed. In business, a good deal, an honorable deal, is struck when both parties are at the table to negotiate the terms. Without Palestinian representation and input, that deal, I believe, will sit in a file, and some will never even open it, because there can be no peace without human dignity. Judaism cultivates a good imagination, and we are trained from the youngest age to have empathy for the other. We see this in the smallest ritual at our Seder tables. When we recall the 10 plagues of Egypt, we remove 10 spoonfuls, or some have 10 pinkyfuls of wine from our cups. If wine is the symbol of our joy, then we show that our joy is diminished as we recall how the Egyptians suffered each one of those plagues. We know that not every Egyptian was a taskmaster, and yet everyone, man, woman, and child, suffered those plagues, and we are able to empathize. The last 2 plagues, which are described in our Parshat Bo, have much to teach us about the power of empathy and the power of the lack of empathy. Rabbi Goodman graciously referenced what I wrote to the congregation this week, and I'm going to share with you the introductory teaching that comes from our sages. First, about the plague of Choshech, the plague of darkness. It is written, "The Eternal said unto Moses, stretch out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt." Or some translations say, a darkness that can be touched. And Moses stretched forth his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness fell over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days no one could move. So what kind of darkness was this? Our ancient rabbis record this in Midrash Shmot Rabbah, the teaching of Rabbi Avdimi of the 3rd or 4th century Haifa, explains that a careful reading of this text hints that there were stages in the plagues of darkness, that this darkness doubled and redoubled. Its volume and its intensity was magnified, multiplied. At first, people lost the ability to see one another. But then they could not move. They could not act. The darkness became debilitating, so much so that a person who was in a sitting position could not stand up 4. And a person who was standing could not sit down to rest with another. And a person who was lying down, Rav Abdini says, could not get up from his bed. So heavy was the darkness. So heavy was the depression that resulted from that plague. This teaching comes as a warning to us all. The plague of darkness overtakes a society, a civilization, even a world in stages. When we forfeit our ability to see one another, we can become paralyzed to act. When we lose the ability to witness the humanity of a fellow human being, we become susceptible to an even greater, even more dangerous kind of darkness. When we turn a blind eye to the suffering of another, we might lose our ability to act on their behalf, to stand up for them, with them. When we become blind to the fact that every person is created in the image of God, we lose the ability to stand with one another and to stand upright before our God. Now, in our Exodus story, we find that, like bookends, the Exodus story begins and ends with a cry. The first cry is of the Israelites, who were crushed under the bondage of slavery. And the next cry, which we read about in our parsha, the Tze'akah Gdolah, is the great cry of the Egyptians when that 10th plague strikes. That 10th plague, what do we know of it? Makat Bechorot, the strike against the firstborn. It is so terrifying. I remember as a mother of young children, when I would tell Bible stories in car rides, schlepping them around town, I didn't know how to describe that 10th plague. And I admit to you that I whitewashed it a little bit when they were little. And there is a custom, Ta'anit Bechorot, Ta'anit Bechorim, the fast of the firstborn. This is another example of how Judaism trains us in empathy. Any firstborn Jew is welcome to take up this fast the day before Pesach. And I know some members of this congregation take this fast very seriously and identify with it very strongly, because this is a way that firstborn Jews can say, I empathize with my fellow firstborns and how the Egyptians suffered so. And so I will fast. I will experience just one small increment of their suffering. These two cries. One of the Israelites is Yiz'aku, Zayin, Ayin, Kuf. And the one of the Egyptians, which we read today, is Tze'akah Gdolah, Sadi, Ayin, Kuf. The only difference between the cry of the Egyptians and the cry of the Israelites is one stroke of the pen to change a Zayin into a Tzadi. Just one stroke. The cries were by different peoples under different circumstances, and yet, when a human being cries, there is so much common ground, so much that we share. It is written that the cry of the Egyptians was heard like never before or since. Because even the slaves, I imagine, could empathize with the suffering of their taskmasters. Yes, justice is always required, but justice does not demand us to be heartless. We have to be schooled in empathy so that even the cry of the enemy is heard as a human cry. Because if we have lost the ability to hear a cry and recognize it as human, then our own humanity is lost. This week I heard a story about my own grandfather I'd never heard before. And I thank my cousin Ari Lorge, Rabbi Ari Lorge from the Central Synagogue of New York, for sharing this story with his congregation. He heard this story from my uncle Michael Lorge. It's about the grandfather that Ari and I share. He fled Nazi Germany when he was a young man at the advice of Rabbi Leo Beck. And the story comes from his school days, when he went to a government public school, Jews and non-Jews together, and each desk, row upon row, had a bench built for two. And so each school child shared that bench with one more. And my grandfather sat every day with a young boy until the laws changed. And my grandfather was forced to go to another school, a separate school for Jewish children. Fast forward, 1964. The German government invited my grandfather to return from the United States to instruct German teachers about the loss of civil rights under Nazi power and to help them write new textbooks to accurately teach the history of Nazi Germany, hoping this would cultivate a spirit of empathy among the new generation of Germans. This would be a short trip for my grandfather, but there was one person from his past he wanted to find. One person he wanted to see. He wanted to meet the boy that sat with him on that bench for so many school days. You see, my grandfather became a rabbi, and that boy had become a Lutheran minister. My grandfather found him, and when they met, the pastor said to my grandfather, "I want you to know the first day you were gone, I thought you were sick. But as the days went by, I asked the teacher, 'Where's Ernst? Where's Ernst?' But the teachers wouldn't answer me. So day after day I kept asking, 'Where is Ernst? What has happened to him? Why won't you tell me?' And after so many days of silence, I realized that I was being taught and trained not to ask questions, and that I was the only one who was asking a question prompted by empathy. But I never stopped thinking about you or wondering about your fate." My grandfather, Rabbi Ernst Lord Alav Shalom, devoted much of his rabbinate to building up interfaith relations and putting those relationships to work for the good of all peoples and for the moral health of America that took him in. He took the hard lessons learned in Nazi Germany about what human beings are capable of, and he applied them to do his part in the civil rights movement. Because his suffering did not sever his capacity to empathize. This is a primary teaching from the Exodus story. The 10 plagues of the Exodus are replaced at Sinai with 10 commandments. The Israelites steadily shed their experience of slavery and replaced it with a moral code given by God. Our ancestors exchanged their rage of mortar and brick and sun and sweat with the readiness to serve God in sacred purpose through a life of mitzvot. In Egypt, our humanity was tested and nearly lost. But then the covenant struck at Sinai. That's where our humanity was found and confirmed and elevated. This is our moral inheritance, the capacity to empathize with those who suffer, the ability to hear when others shut their ears, the ability to see when others turn a blind eye, the ability to act when others might be frozen by fear or hatred. This is our sacred inheritance. May it be the call that we hear and respond to day by day.